something that Du Bois kind of first formulated, in the sense of, the question, how does it feel to be a problem? And I want to put the emphasis on the being part of that, as far as on the ontological question of lived black experience. So I think that's really what his book tackles and does really, really well, is that it fleshes out in this very visceral, poetic language, lived black experience in ways that, is very rare. And I think that's why it touched a certain consensus among the general public. Unfortunately, and there's this quote just in the book I'm gonna read now, and it kind of sums up, kind of in a nutshell, some of the, I guess, what I find also problematic about his take of the lived black experience. And then he goes, the question of how one should live within this black body, I have found, ultimately answers itself. Now, in one sense, you look at it, okay, that makes sense. But in another sense, what's missing? If you have a question that answers itself, you're missing then the questioning. You're missing then a certain form of agency and subjectivity, which you kind of touched on, to then bring about the answer. In another part of the book, he mentions how the arc of history doesn't bend on the, the arc of history doesn't flow on the arc of justice. Yeah, it doesn't bend towards justice, which I'm fine with. However, if it doesn't bend on justice on its own, then how can we make it then bend towards justice? And so that's the thing. He introduces a lot of issues, and basically, what he does is he's very gifted at historical indictment, without any emancipatory imperative. And so, like if you read it, like you're like, holy shit, I'm about to set it off. Like, this is going on, but then you look for more, and it's just, it kind of leaves you hanging. And again, I'm not saying that it's his responsibility. This goes back to the question of intellectual engagement. I'm not looking at him for answers, but don't also, engage in, basically this kind of epistemic closure. It's almost like there's a closure of questions. It's just like, and the struggle, the beautiful struggle that he's talking about actually here, ends up not being a struggle of liberation, but merely a struggle of survival. And so, but the thing is, he's such a gifted writer that he kind of plays between the two. And he kind of, so, and even when you read about his description of police violence, he compares it to like a force of nature, a volcano or something along those lines. And so, again, especially within the context of what's going on in Baltimore, what's his hometown, with what's going on in Ferguson, with what's going on in the streets all over Chicago, to compare police violence to a natural disaster, what does that do to brothers and sisters who are struggling in the streets? You know what I'm saying? I mean, that, and so again, it's not that I'm not expecting him to come up with any formulaic solutions, but at the very least, as a writer, I'm going to critique the implications of his work as well. And so that's where I think, again, there's just a lot to be desired within that context. But again, it's still an incredible and great read. Another thing I want to touch on is his use of the body, which is so important because, again, it brings this kind of, you really get a feel and a sense, but through that, at times, almost, I honestly felt like I was reading through a slave ledger. You know what I mean? In the sense of his reductionism is so vulgar. Like there's no, Fanon himself talked about the body, but it was always within the context of bringing about the questions of human subjectivity, of agency, and with codes that are missing. And again, and it's not because he's not familiar with it. He came from the Mecca. He was exposed to all this. Actually, in The Beautiful Struggle, he mentions Fanon, but only as a pickup line. You know what I mean? Like he said, and so I always, he does, only as a pickup. He mentions, brothers use Fanon to get, whatever. So, but he doesn't engage with Fanon the thinker. And so he was exposed to Fanon. Not only that, but his dad is a publisher for Black Classics Press, which publishes books that I use, Blood in My Eye, George Jackson, Seize the Time, Bobby Seale, The Panthers of Black Cat, Reginald C. Major. 3 books right there would help alleviate his kind of dismissal of agency on the thing. But I think this also comes to it's almost like there's a, especially after the counter-revolutionary blowback of what took place after the 60s and 70s, especially because his father was a Black Panther and then engaged in the publishing press as kind of the transition away from that. Coates actually saw his father's intellectual engagement as kind of a step away from the radical struggle, instead of seeing it as a new form of radical engagement. And I think that informs his work as well. And so in a sense, again, he's kind of just trying to, he kind of moves away. His whole goal, it seems to me, especially in the language he uses, he talks about, he says, at one point, he talks about how he was coming to his own, and he's like, and I started becoming conscious, and this meant, at some point a clash with the streets. So I'm like, oh, all right, I've been there, I know what that's about. And then I'm thinking, okay, so the streets, and then after the clash with the streets, he's gonna come into clash with established power. So I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and he only clashed with the streets. He never once confronted established power. You know what I mean? And so again, it's just, and from that perspective, you know, and he almost uses Baldwin's rhetoric, which was to speak of political issues with the spiritual tone, and rhetoric, as you mentioned, from his background in the church. And so Coates, unfortunately, speaks of social historical oppression with the biological language. So, you know, you get this understanding of almost mystifying social historical oppression, you know, as some product of a chaotic universe in which there is no, you know, and so again, it's very interesting, and also it's rarely mentioned, but I actually see kind of a difference in it. He actually reminds me of Camus in a sense of his absurdity, because it's not like Sartrean ambiguity in which there is no meaning, and hence the lack of objective meaning is basically potentiality for us to impose our own meaning upon the world. But the Camusian absurdity is about there's just absurd, and you're just pushing, you know, there's no, you know, even no matter what you do, there's just no meaning to it. And I think that also reflected in you know, in that kind of, you know, within that struggle as well. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. But again, the main thing I just want to stress is when you read Ta-Nehisi Coates, appreciate him. I mean, like, one thing I like is he's a writer, so when I read him, like I said, he just kind of makes me step my game up. You know, I'm just like, whoa, okay, he's bringing it. All right, how is he bringing it? Okay, he's doing this. Then I'm like, wait a minute, this cat, okay. You know, so again, so as a writer, you know, it's not like a partisan slam on him. You know, I appreciate what he brings to the table, and I'm not expecting him to solve, you know, any issues. But again, it's that historical indictment, you know, without, you know, an emancipatory imperative that becomes very popular, because then it allows people to feel bad about the way things are, but without feeling any kind of, you know, need to try to make it difference in whatever way they decide to make that difference. And I think that's why it's become very popular in a lot of different circles, because he doesn't make people kind of, you know, challenge, you know, their own, you know, way of looking at the world in a sense of where they have to do anything. You know, and again, it's not that, and this is where, again, I want to open this up later as far as we're dealing with questions of intellectual engagement. You know, like, what is the role of the writer? What is it? The good thing is the book at least stimulated this panel. You know what I mean? So, you know, when I see Coates, I'll be like, yo, you know, thanks for the panel idea. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so it's just, at the very least, it's allowing us, and that's what great work does, is it brings all these questions to the fore in a way that allows us then to engage them and come with a different understanding. So again, especially here at the Left Forum, and as, you know, dealing with activists and people who are on the grassroots level trying to put in work, you know, just don't get caught up in the way the media is putting them. And again, I don't think it's an accident that at this time, when there's all this unrest, dealing with, you know, social historical violence, structural inert oppression that's going on, that all of a sudden he's being pushed to the fore. Because again, when you push him to the fore, it diminishes, again, through his work, and it's an implied diminishing. Through his work, it diminishes questions of human agency that are so vital for brothers and sisters struggling in the streets.